We are now entering our first panel, which we have planned, diversity and inclusion, which will be moderated by Shirin. I'm just going to hand it over to you, Shirin.
Thanks, Scott. Sorry, it was just, 2 years of Zoom and I still don't really have a handle on Zoom. But yeah, hi everyone and welcome to our first panel where we will be talking about diversity and inclusion. I'm Shirin, and previous to my hiatus at Imperial Business School, I actually worked at the nexus of diversity and finance, really looking to understand impact of gender lens investing. And so I'm delighted to be joined by our three panelists, Jessica Espinoza, who is the CEO of 2X Challenge, Ming-Tsung, who is a lecturer in finance at the University of Essex, and then Pooja Eppanapally, who is a senior associate at the Women of the World Endowment. So yeah, thank you for joining us. So I was wondering if we could kick off, and I guess I wanted to start at the beginning and really ask all of my panelists, what brought you to working within the diversity and inclusion space? And also what key challenges are you trying to solve within the research that you're doing and the communities that you serve? So maybe Jessica, you could start us off.
Happy to. Hi, Shirin. Hi, fellow panelists. Hi, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be here today. I'm Jessica Spinozza, chair of the 2X Challenge and the new CEO of the 2X Collaborative. And what brought me to the space, well, I've been working in the area of impact investing and the financial industry for over a decade. And on the one hand, it was often quite lonely as one of the executive women in the financial industry around the world. But also, it always struck me how little diverse and inclusive the culture of finance is. And I think we've made a lot of progress over the past, since I started over the past decade, which is great. But one particular barrier which we still haven't been able to really tackle is the fact that still only 2% of venture capital goes to women-founded startups. And there is a massive funding gap to women entrepreneurs. So my work focuses on looking at the way we allocate capital. So I think that's a very timely discussion and very relevant for the audience today. So what role do we as capital allocators, as asset owners and managers play in allocating capital? But also how is that related to the culture that we have in our own organization and the representation of people in investment decision making?
Awesome, thank you. Pooja, would you like to introduce yourself next?
Yes, it is so wonderful to be here. Thank you, ExecuShe team, for inviting me to join this panel. I am Pooja Eppanapally. I'm a senior associate at Women of the World Endowment. And Women of the World Endowment, or WOWE, is a mission-aligned endowment that is focused on investing in and through women as change makers. And the reason I got into the diversity and inclusion space, and it's a story very similar to Jessica, actually. I started my career in finance and in a very traditional white male-dominated industry of investment banking. And the first role that I was in, I was the only female investment professional at my firm and in my group. And it was such a stark and jarring culture shock for me. And I really wanted to pursue, my career in capital markets long term in order to be in that driver's seat where capital is allocated and make sure that there is increased diversity, gender, racial, diversity looks like different forms, so the list can go on, but including more of that in capital markets. And that's one thing that we're doing at WOWE as in my role as leader of the private markets and grant investments division at the endowment. We're making sure that capital is allocated to funds and companies that are aligned with that mission of putting women in the role of change makers and solution drivers, addressing the world's most pressing problems.
Thank you. Ming Tang, would you like to go next?
Yes, thank you for the, thank you for inviting me into the panel. I'm Ming-Tsung. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm the lecturer in the University of Essex. I think I originally, my research is in the asset pricing. So why I will continue, why I will be in this working area, because my co-authors invite me to work on this area. It's quite interesting and a new area to me. I think the big challenging when doing research in terms of diversity and inclusion is that it's because my research originally is more like a traditional asset pricing. So there is a conflict between the view of the traditional asset pricing and the diversity and the inclusion, the view in the diversity and inclusion. The reason is, if we talk about a very basic asset pricing model, for example, we always want the maximum value of the shareholders. But when we look at the diversity and inclusion view, you'll find out the view will be more like the overall stakeholder. So it'll be like a quite challenging for me when I study in this area, but it's quite interesting. Yes. But I think in the recent years, as like Jessica said, there are more venture capitals are looking into this area. I mean, for example, like the pension funds, for example, like pension funds or other firms, when their core value, I would like to say is the core value would be they try to embrace a broader view of the core value. For example, they will look at whether the firm is more gender diverse, they care about their stakeholders, something like that. So I think it's a quite interesting trend in this industry. Thank you.
That's super insightful and actually kind of leads on very nicely onto my next question. So I guess 2020, 2021 really saw diversity and inclusion come to the fore again within the finance arena. And Pooja, I was wondering if you could maybe start us off by shedding some light on the key trends that you see within the diversity and inclusion space, especially as we transition into 2022.
Yes, definitely. Shirin, like you said, D&I has come to the forefront for numerous reasons. And I think with that, we're seeing a trend of holding corporations and investors more accountable for D&I. And with that accountability, what's going to fuel that is the need for data and the importance that we can place on data to help us keep companies and investors and funds more responsible and accountable for D&I and making sure that they are not just doing this for lip service, that they are really truly showing that commitment to D&I. And we at Huawei really see that as important, and we are investing and partnering with data tools that are aggregating data and putting that out there for transparency, for investors to see which corporations are, how they're faring on D&I, and making sure that they can place their investment dollars in companies that are doing so. I'd like to share just one or two examples of this to really paint a picture. So one of the tools that we are partnering with is called As You Sow, which is a nonprofit leader in mutual fund data and being able to help investors choose the right mutual funds and play their role in shareholder advocacy. So how we're partnering with them is, we are a customer or a user of this data. We use it to help us determine our mutual funds portfolio at Huawei. And we are also an advisory committee member of theirs. And so we are really getting our hands in there to help them determine which screens and metrics to use, helping them guide their data strategy. And so we would like to kind of use our role as a place of influence to help them inject more data on gender, on diversity from the forefront. So that's one example. Another example is a company called Ethos ESG. We are a user, an early investor, as well as a strategic partner with this company. And they're doing a similar thing to collect data on more so public companies, as well as some mutual funds as well. They collect data on over 10,000 companies and funds from 250 sources and aggregate all this data on a central platform, again, to help investors, asset owners, and asset allocators be able to invest with a values-aligned way. So we are also there at the table, helping them with their KPIs and also bringing gender to the forefront, especially when there are going to be increasing disclosures coming to the US. That's already happened in Europe. And so that is only going to be another trend that we're seeing. Again, the importance of data will be there and will be there in 2022 and obviously years to come.
Yeah, that's super fascinating. Thank you. Jessica, do you have the same insights into trends, or particularly with your focus on perhaps seed and early stage investing?
Yeah, I think it's a similar observation, and looking at it a bit more from the perspective of private markets. So I've been mostly active in venture capital, private equity, and then also private debt. So kind of in the stage of companies that may be quite fast growing and already big, but before they actually get publicly listed. Although we do also see now a lot of convergence with public markets. So I think, these trends are coming from both sides, and then we see it in our work with the pension funds and other big institutional investors that they're coming at it from the other perspective, and then we co-invest, for example, in private equity funds together. But there's definitely been a lot of traction in recent years. And for us, we started with the 2X Challenge in 2018. The 2X Challenge was initially launched by the development finance institutions of the G7 countries at the G7 summit in 2018. And back then, gender lens investing was kind of picking up, especially in our area of emerging markets. But there wasn't really any standard yet of how to invest with a gender lens in the private sector and in private markets. So we started with this challenge where we went on stage together with our CEOs and said, okay, we commit to invest at least 3 billion over 3 years with a gender lens. And we weren't really sure at the time what it actually meant, so developed the criteria. And I remember everybody was so nervous when we announced the 3 billion target because it felt really ambitious. And then within those less than 3 years, we had surpassed it 3 times. And what I think was particularly interesting to see is the COVID year in 2020 was actually the year when we saw most pipeline and most investment opportunities under this gender lens strategy. And so we closed 2020 with $11.4 billion that we had mobilized towards private sector companies that have a diversity and inclusion, and especially a gender focus. And I think it was, on the one hand, really demonstrating the business case, but it was also, I think, back to what my colleague just mentioned, like really this awareness. And I think COVID has exacerbated a lot of the gaps that were always there, but has also made it much more visible, and so has also activated people to pay attention and to be more conscious about how we allocate capital, what cultures we are promoting within our own organizations and also the wider ecosystem.
Yeah, definitely. Ming-Tsung, does this kind of translate to what you're seeing within the research space? And yeah, what do you think are the key trends amongst your fellow academics?
Yes, I kind of agree with Jessica and the patient's views. I think in recent years we can see that the people are more interested in in terms of investment, they are more they are increasing interested in divergence and inclusion investments. So that it means people, for the investors, they are kind of willing to put the money in the company with that embrace a higher level of diversity. So especially in recent years, there are some ETF, gender diversity index in ETF issued, and they kind of attract a lot of money, including money from the pension funds. In terms of because my research interest is also to see whether those ETF can outperform other traditional ETF. So my recent working paper is to examine whether their performance, in general, can really underperform or outperform those traditional ETF or investments. Although it seems like in terms of the return, it will be more like the same. However, when we talk about the risk, for the ETF that involve in gender diversity, they do have the less risk. So like Jessica said, in these 2 years, we have the COVID years, right? And if for investors, if they invest in the ETF that related to the gender diversity, they probably will suffer less. So there's the recent research findings in these years. But I would like to say one more thing about the trend in recent years, because in recent years people are more aware of the ESG or the diversity and inclusion. So so the investors are kind of, it will relate to Shirin, your next question, but I think it would be better to mention it here. Because for the investors, they really want to know if maybe for the hedge funds, they said they want to invest the money in the company with diversity and inclusion. Once the hedge funds have the money, do they really do things they are promised? In the recent research in MIT, they find out for the hedge funds, they not often do what they said. So that's the problem here. And another research, they said that there's some ESG washing or greenwashing in the hedge funds. But for the investors, they do not really see, they do not really have the tool to identify whether these funds can really hold their commitments. I think there's something maybe she can look into to include the data in the database to help the investor to figure out whether they are the true green or ESG companies who are not. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, this brings me on to my final question before I kind of open up the floor for audience questions. But yeah, last year really saw the emergence of critiques in the whole ESG process and space, with a lot of focus being placed within the public discourse on the fact that maybe ESG was venturing more into a box ticking exercise. So I wonder, Jessica, if you could maybe start us off with how much you feel diversity and inclusion commitments are true commitments to fostering diversity and inclusion versus them just being box ticking exercises.
Yeah, thank you. Very interesting question. And we've seen a lot of debate going on, especially I think in the past 18 months or so. And I think what is interesting, kind of taking a step back and looking at the evidence base, one reason why everybody is so excited about this is obviously because it's the right thing to do. And I think, there's now more than ever recognition of that. And that is great. But another thing that investors in particular are often emphasizing is the business case, and that's compelling for investors, also mainstream investors, as well as the companies. But if you actually look at the studies and the evidence base, research shows that you have these business case effects when the commitment is genuine and when you actually value diversity and inclusion within your company. If you only see it superficially and, for example, put women or other underrepresented groups into decision making, but then kind of silo them and don't take their perspectives into account, for example, or if you allocate capital with a superficial gender and inclusion lens, then you don't have the same kind of effect in terms of the business or impact case. And I think that is, that's quite interesting, and also speaks to the fact that you really have to value diversity and to promote meaningful action. It's not just about ticking boxes or kind of reporting something. So that is one thing, and I think that's quite aligned with what we want to achieve. The other thing is what I found particularly interesting now that we've launched a 2X Collaborative as an industry body that's convening the entire spectrum of investors, so going beyond the development finance institutions, also welcoming big global pension funds and big commercial banks, and really the full spectrum, is that especially the private sector and the mainstream representatives, they are asking us a lot of questions about, how do we maintain this high credibility and preserve the brand, and how do we ensure that the brand is not used for pink washing, and how can we elevate the standard further? And I think this is exciting to see because conventional wisdom might suggest that the more commercial motivated players would be the ones that that might just pay lip service, but we actually see a lot of interest from them to have a credible commitment and to engage in gender lens investing meaningfully. And so that I think is a big opportunity. At the same time, we see quite a lot of interest in further kind of assurance and certification. So we're working on a 2X certification mechanism that will allow institutional investors as well as funds and products like, for example, gender bonds to have an external certification that they are actually aligned with the 2X criteria and have a meaningful gender and diversity and inclusion lens across all of the 2X criteria. And this is something where we see a lot of demand in the market that I think will further take us into this direction.
That's amazing. Yeah, that's really hopeful. Pooja, what's your view on pink washing in general, and whether diversity and inclusion has become a box ticking approach?
Yeah, this is a good question, and Jessica shed a lot of really great light on this already. My view is not to harp on the whatever I said for the previous question that you asked me, but this is again where data is very important in order to differentiate between pink washing and green washing, and the tools that I mentioned as you Ethos. We also use a tool for private markets called Tonic Tracer, and we also leverage Equileap data for gender diversity data. And again, ExecuSheet can also play a huge role in helping combat against pink washing and green washing. So it's going to be ever more difficult for investors to differentiate between the companies that are just box ticking versus genuinely interested in a commitment to D&I. But with the trends towards greater disclosures, greater transparency, and the availability of data, I think that this is something that we will be able to have a lot more resources to doing better in. So I think that will be the potential for the years to come for investors to get more access to data to avoid pink washing and green washing.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, and thank you to all the panelists who spoke. I now want to take the opportunity to just open up the floor. So if you're in the audience and you have any questions, please do ask away. The first question is directed to Pooja and Jessica. What are the greatest challenges that you face as you seek to disrupt the gender landscape and push capital towards fostering greater diversity and inclusion? I don't know, Jessica, maybe you want to start?
So something that very interesting that has actually surprised me is I always thought, you have kind of, if you look at the private equity space, you have the traditional firms that have been around for a few decades, and they are raising their fourth, or at least their third, their fourth, their fifth fund. And they have been what has been previously described on this panel, kind of pale male, so very little diversity. And I've been surprised to see how change is happening there in terms of transformation. At the same time, you have a whole new generation of emerging fund managers that are raising their first fund. And these are diverse teams. They usually have a very strong culture of diversity and inclusion because they want to build their own firm that is very different from what they have seen in the past and the challenges that they have faced as investment professionals. And they typically have a very focused strategy on backing underrepresented founders. And paradoxically, these funds are really struggling in their fundraising. And what I've seen both in my experience as a practitioner in the investment field, but also as part of my own PhD research, is that the gender and racial bias that we observe in capital allocation to entrepreneurs is reproduced and perpetuated at the level of capital allocation from capital allocators to fund managers. And I think this is currently a blind spot where, everybody's talking about transformation. And of course, that's so important to transform established fund management firms. Equally, it's important to bring up the next generation of fund managers, that have founding partners that are diverse. And these are often women-led funds. And so I would really like to see more capital flowing to this next generation of fund managers. And we have just launched a new initiative to ExDI, that is a facility to accelerate exactly these type of fund managers. But I would love to see much more action into this direction. And that for me is the hardest challenge that we're currently facing.
Just to echo on that, that is also a huge challenge that I see in my work at Huawei. I mean, one of our core tenets is to support diverse fund managers, but it is also going to be a great push to kind of dismantle the existing infrastructure in how we evaluate fund managers. So kind of doing an overhaul of the due diligence questionnaires, for instance, looking at alternative track records, because emerging fund managers won't have, a traditional track record to present. So we have to think about how we can evaluate other sorts of track record that might not be a traditional investment experience. And the list goes on, but we need to be, thinking a little bit more creatively on how we can take apart kind of the old school infrastructure and old school way of thinking in order to encourage more emerging fund managers that are diverse. And so that's something at Huawei that I'm thinking about every single day, and I definitely want to get a lot better in this so we can also play a part in this transition to more diversity in capital markets.
That's really interesting. Yeah, generally when I think of diversity and inclusion, I'm thinking more on the company level. I've never kind of swiveled around and looked at diversity in terms of fund managers. So this question is for Ming-Tsung. Much of the research at the intersection of finance and diversity focuses on the board level. Why is it important to broaden this to include top management? as you have done in your research?
Yeah, I think there are two reasons on why much of the research they look at the broad of directors level. I think the first reason is if we talk about the decision making, and most of the decision making are at the board of the directors. So if we want to look at the impact of the gender diversity, we probably will look at the board level. Okay, so this is the first reason. The second reason is why we don't want to broaden the board level into like the top management. I think there are a couple of research they include more than board of the directors. They include some to see whether all the top managers who are not in the board of directors and see whether they also impose some influence on the decision making. But the finding is kind of mixed. The reason is again, if we talk about the diversity research, data is quite important. And when we talk about the completion of the data, board data is more complete than the data in the top management. So that's why most of the research, they will look at, the board level only. Yeah. So hopefully my answer I answer the questions.
Yeah, thank you. That's super insightful. So, and this one, I guess, is to anybody, but previously in our introduction, Helen mentioned the importance of having targets / quotas to foster diversity and inclusion, and I was just wondering what everyone felt about having quotas either within companies or within your due diligence process, and whether you thought that was effective or not. Maybe Pooja, you can start.
Yeah, that's a tricky question because I feel like on one hand, a target or a quota might also lead to box ticking, and it may not kind of include that, genuine intention to foster diversity and inclusion if it's just a quota. But I also see the value in it to kind of jumpstart the fostering of diversity inclusion, especially in companies and in funds that don't have any diversity. It might foster that sort of culture and environment at the firm. But I personally see it maybe more in line with kind of the concerns we might have around box ticking and doing it for the sake of lip service rather than for a genuine commitment to diversity. So I think it's a tricky question, a tricky subject. But we see some evidence of it. I know in politics, we see some quotas to foster diversity and in getting more diverse backgrounds and opinions into policymaking. So it can go either way. It's a tricky question.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with you in the sense that I think that diversity and inclusion quotas definitely allow for the opening up of spaces that were previously closed off. But yeah, as you go further into it, it does perhaps become more of a box ticking process. Jessica, do you agree? What's your view?
When it comes to quotas, for example, for boards or for leadership positions, I'm a big fan because in my experience, it's the only thing that will actually lead to a cultural change. Like, I've seen people say, oh, we don't need it because we will get there, but then you don't get there. And if you just look at the progress, it will still take 260 something, I think 267 years to close the economic gender gap globally at the current rate of progress. Like we just have to speed it up. And so in my experience, again, like working in companies, you know, when I saw like what actually creates new policies, new practices, and cultural change is if you have a target, because then you are kind of working towards something, right? I think it's similar, for example, I mean, you know, maybe very simplistic, but if you say, oh, we want to improve portfolio quality, yes, but if you don't have a target and, you know, something like a number in mind, you're not necessarily getting there. So I just think it's important to have a clear target and to know where you want to get in order to then put in motion the kind of changes in policies, processes, cultural aspects, and really working towards that vision. But again, it might be company specific. There might, of course, be companies that could do it without a clearly defined target. But in my experience, a target definitely helps, and that's kind of what speeds up progress. When it comes to investment targets, I think that tends to be a little bit more complex, because then it's usually, you know, this whole discussion about bonus and the bonus system. So do you have, for example, a team target, an organizational target, a personal target? And I think that is a bit more challenging because it's more complex, and it can also lead more to box ticking when you're just calculating your short-term bonus all the time. That has happened in my experience a lot, not necessarily with gender or diversity targets, but simply with any type of impact targets. And so I think there you have to be really smart about the time frame, and then at what level the target is, and how you actually measure it. But generally speaking, I think targets definitely help.
So someone just posted in the chat saying, agreed, Jessica, if equitable practice would have happened organically, we wouldn't need to focus on gender equality. And that was Leanne Mayer. So yeah, thank you. If anyone has any more questions, please feel free to add them to the chat. But so one of my final questions was really quite broad-based and directed to everyone, but what makes you hopeful / excited about the diversity and inclusion space in 2022? Yeah, I'm not sure. Pooja, would you like to start us off?
Yes. Well, we've been talking about the past 2 years being very challenging for everybody, and so that obviously makes me want to be very optimistic for the world going forward in 2022. I mean, we've seen a lot of progress in 2021. I mean, we've seen women really step up in the pandemic efforts. Women were at the central of vaccine development, and healthcare workers and teachers, and we really showed the power of women to be change makers in some of the most challenging times. And in 2021, we've seen the most number, or the number of women leaders of Fortune 500 companies reached an all-time high. And I'm just, very hopeful and excited that this momentum will continue into 2022, and we will achieve greater diversity in our workplaces.
Thank you. Ming-Tsung, would you like to follow?
Yes, I think in the coming year, I think I agree with everyone that we will see more and more firms to embrace the diversity and inclusion. But as I said previously, I will also feel excited to see whether in terms of the academic area, we will to identify whether the firms they are just doing the pink washing or green washing, or they are really their core value really embrace the true diversity and inclusion.
Absolutely. Yeah. Jessica, would you like to kind of conclude on what you're most hopeful about?
I'm personally super excited about the 2X Collaborative, our new industry body for gender-lens investing. And I'm excited to see the interest and the traction that gender-lens investing and 2X has among the more traditional investors, and that we're now bringing on board the full spectrum of investors both emerging markets, global north, really globally, to co-invest together. And one thing that I'm in particular looking forward to is really shifting more capital. So, we've been so proud about the 11 billion. I wonder, what would be a good time frame to get to 1 trillion. And I think if we get the big asset owners and asset managers on board, it's definitely something that we can achieve in the future. So I'm hopeful that we can engage much more in co-investing and making the pipeline visible, and then actually shifting capital, because that at the end of the day I think will be the kind of what we want to get measured against, to actually see how the talking translates into money moving.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us in this deep dive into diversity and inclusion. Thank you so much for my panelists. You've been great and very insightful. I will hand everything back to you, Scott, I guess.